True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
So today we're going way back to the 1940s. It was just after midnight on Christmas Eve of 1945, and Jennie Sodder woke up to the smell of smoke. The home she shared with her husband George and 9 of their children was going up in flames. It would be over 7 hours before the fire department arrived, and by then the 2-story house had burned to the ground, and 5 of the Sodder children were missing. In fact, to this day, no one knows what happened to the Sodder children. Their family never saw them again, and their remains were never found. Join us at the quiet end for the Missing Sodder Children. Although authorities determined that the children, Maurice 14, Martha 12, Louis 10, Jennie Irene 8, and Betty just 5 years old, had died in the fire, their family was not convinced. How could they have perished in the fire without any bones being found? None. Now, because of some strange events before, during, and after the tragic fire, as well as a stunningly incompetent investigation, this case continues to be one of history's most disturbing and intriguing unsolved mysteries. So you know what I always like with a mystery?
You like a beer?
A beer, yes.
Well, this crime took place in West Virginia. So I have a beer from Morgantown Brewing Company. It's called 80 Shilling. It's a Scottish ale. These are nice beers. They're usually fairly low alcohol and have a nice caramel toffee taste to them. So this particular one is 4.9% alcohol by volume. It's a kind of a medium brown, a little bit of a tan head. Nice aroma, caramel, molasses, very sweet. And the taste follows the nose quite nicely. The sweetness seems to be more of a toffee type taste. Good beer.
Sounds pretty good, yeah. I love a little caramel molasses flavor. And pretty low alcohol. That means we can drink as many as we want.
Well, maybe not as many as we want, but we don't have to split it.
Right. Well, let's open a couple of them.
All right.
Okay, Dickie. So I was considering, is this really a crime? We don't really know if it's a crime, right? It's a mystery. But in my mind, there was a crime. I can't say that I know what it was exactly, but let's go over the whole thing. It's very complicated and see what we think at the end of this.
Well, yeah, we figure out what happened to the 5 missing kids or not. There was a crime. Somebody torched the house.
Well, that was never proven, though.
No, but
no, the fire investigators said that it was caused by an electrical problem.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about noises on the roof.
Yeah. Okay, so you're on board with me that a crime did occur of some kind.
Yes.
Okay. All right, come on down here to the quiet end and start us off with the story.
Okay. So for about 40 years, there's a billboard off Route 16 outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia, showing the grainy black and white photos of the 5 missing Sodder children. All 5 of the kids have large brown eyes and fine facial features, confirming their Italian heritage. All are unsmiling. Since their home burned down in a fire in 1945, speculation about their fates has run wild. But any evidence is either lacking or was mishandled early on.
Yes, so the father of this family was George Sodder. He was an Italian immigrant who came to the U.S. back in 1911 when he was just 13. He came over with his brother, but his brother returned home shortly after. One rumor was that George was sent away from Italy so he wouldn't be held responsible for his father's death, but we have no evidence of that. George first arrived in New York, and he later worked in Pennsylvania and in Michigan. He worked on railroads for a while, and then when he was about 22, he registered for the Selective Service. Then he worked as a plumber's assistant in Detroit, and he would send money back home to help support his parents. In the 1920s, George settled in West Virginia. He worked in the coal mines and drove a taxi at night. George's wife-to-be was Jennie Cipriani. She was born in 1902 in Italy, and her family migrated to the United States and arrived in New York in 1904. Her family spent some time in Pennsylvania before they moved to West Virginia, and Jennie met George when he came into the store that her father owned there. George and Jennie got married in 1922, and then they lived in the town of Smithers, where there was a very large Italian community.
In 1923, when he was 25 years old, George applied to become a naturalized citizen. The application had his birth date as November 24, 1897. He was from Tula, Italy, and he traveled to the United States on the ship the Eurona. In the application, George had to swear that he was not an anarchist or a polygamist. He filed these papers in February of 1923, but there's no record of him ever completing the naturalization process. Now, he was later quoted in a newspaper saying that he felt as long as he obeyed the laws of the United States, naturalization wasn't necessary.
Which makes some sense, I guess.
Yeah, you gotta stay out of trouble.
Yeah, that's for sure. At the turn of the century, between 1880 and 1915, nearly 13 million Italians left Italy. About 4 million ended up living in the U.S. About 84% of them were from southern Italy. So once they were processed through Ellis Island, they went wherever cheap labor was needed. In West Virginia, most of the work was in the coal mines and on the railroads. The main reason most of them left Italy was due to the poverty there and the opportunities in the U.S. In southern Italy, a small number of landowners controlled most of the land, and they would pass it on from generation to generation. So this meant that the average worker had no chance at improving their standing or even at living a comfortable life. So that's super depressing.
It is, but land of opportunity.
Right.
Come to the United States.
But George did okay, financially.
Well, he did quite well, I think.
Yeah, considering what he'd been through. George and Jennie had 5 children while still living in Smithers, and then they had to move around a lot as George followed coal mining jobs. Then in 1935, they moved to Fayetteville. George left the coal mines and went to work for Jennie and Company, a hauling and transfer company which had an engineering company, a construction company, a lumber yard, and a general store. So a big business by those standards of the day in that area.
Yeah, and the Sodders bought an 8-room house just outside of Fayetteville. The property was registered in Jennie's name only because George was not a citizen. And maybe it was designed to protect it from being taken by creditors if hard times hit at a later date.
Sure.
One of the partners in the Jennie Company agreed to co-sign the loan, and in exchange, George agreed to make him the beneficiary of the home's insurance policy on the house in case something happened to it. That way, he would be reimbursed for his loan to Sodder. Now, I'm a little leery of that.
Leery in what way?
Well, it sounds like they might be trying to do something.
Well, that's something we're going to consider after the fire because, of course, having his name on the homeowner's policy did give Jennie kind of a motive to destroy the house. So that's definitely something we will talk about. So after a few more years, the Sodders had 10 children. George was really self-reliant and saw himself and his children as Americans. In fact, he didn't even like his children to speak Italian around the house. He was also a man of his word and had a very strong work ethic. He also had strong beliefs and opinions, though, which sometimes made him unpopular with some people in the community. So it was in 1943 when George left the Jennie Company and went out on his own. There was talk about him having disagreements with the owners of the company over Italian politics, but we don't know if that's why he left. But George and Jennie bought the Dempsey Transfer Company that was failing at that time. And with his 2 oldest sons helping and Jennie keeping the books, George ran his own business called the Sodder Trucking Company. He got his commercial truck driver's license and began to use their basement as a repair shop for their trucks. By 1945, he had 6 trucks. He primarily transferred supplies from the Fayette Railroad Station to Fayetteville.
George's dedication to being self-sufficient was evident in his personal and political beliefs. He felt that the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was a threat to freedom. At the same time, many other Italians living in the area believed that Mussolini had made Italy into a great country, that was soon to become a great power, and they resented George's opinion of Mussolini. The family would claim that George had been threatened by many of his fellow Italians.
So that's something to keep in mind.
That's definitely something to keep in mind.
Many of the pro-Mussolini Italians could have been members of the SOIA, Sons of Italy in America. SOIA was involved in promoting Mussolini's fascist ideas in the U.S. By 1945, George had been in the country for over 30 years. Although he never did become a citizen, his loyalty to the U.S. was never questioned. He was a man who was just very grateful to the country that allowed him the freedom and the opportunity to own his own business and his own home.
Yeah, I mean, you could point to him and his family as a success story.
It's kind of like the American dream from the time, yeah. So let's fast forward now to Christmas Eve 1945 and go over exactly what happened.
Right. So it was very cold on Christmas Eve, 1945. And the Sodder family was making their preparations for a large Christmas celebration. The younger children were home from school, and the older family members were finished with work for the day. The house was decorated with Christmas lights, and a big meal was planned. But the family was disappointed that the second oldest son, Joe, was still in North Carolina awaiting discharge from the Army. They were happy and relieved that Joe and the oldest son, John, had made it through World War II alive and uninjured.
Yes, but they were just kind of sad that Joe wasn't able to join them for Christmas. So there were actually 11 people in the house, the 9 kids, plus Jennie and George. So that night, George and Jennie were the first to go to bed, along with the youngest child, Sylvia, who was only 3 years old. So this was around 9 p.m. Then a short time later, John and Ted, who both worked with their father, went to bed. 5 of the younger children got permission from Jennie to stay up and play with their new toys. These were Maurice, Betty, Jennie, Louis, and Martha. Mary Ann, the oldest daughter, fell asleep on the couch where the younger children were playing, and weather reports for that night were for snow with a very cold wind. But the story of the Sodder fire and investigation really began about 3 months prior to the fire itself. One of the first odd incidents was a visit from local insurance agent Rosser Long. Mr. Long had been referred to the Sodders by Fiorenzo Giannutullo, who George used to work for. Mr. Giannutullo had co-signed the bank loan for George Sodder's house, remember? And on this visit in September, Mr. Long wanted George to buy life insurance on himself and his family members. George was surprised by this request, but he made it clear that he wasn't interested in buying any life insurance. The agent then suggested that George should increase the amount of insurance he carried on his house from $1,500 to $1,750. He said that this had been suggested by Mr. Giannutullo, since he was the co-signer on the home loan and the beneficiary on the insurance. But George declined, and the agent finally left the home.
See, that's a red flag for me.
That's the first red flag, yeah.
Why would the guy who co-signed the note be so interested in insurance?
Exactly. Yes, definitely a motivation there that we won't overlook.
Well, then a few weeks later, a stranger showed up at the Sodder house asking for work with George's business. George told the man that he wasn't hiring. Then, on his own, the stranger walked around to the back of the house. George followed him. When they got to the back of the house where the power came in from a line to the fuse box, the stranger said to George, "That's going to cause a fire someday. It's faulty." But then George explained that he had recently had an electric stove installed, and that required a separate power line that had been installed by a licensed electrician and checked by the local power company. So he wasn't worried about the fuse box causing a fire.
Yes.
And the stranger eventually left.
Yeah, but this was weird.
Yeah, that's weirdness number 2.
So if this guy's going to the house because George owns a business and, looking for work, that's one thing. But why would he just walk off toward the back of the house and then George would have to follow him to see what he was up to? And then his statement, that's going to cause a fire someday, it's faulty. It really makes you wonder, is this kind of like saying, nice place you got here, be a shame if something happened to it? It's kind of the vibe I get.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, according to the West Virginia State Fire Marshal's investigation report, after the conversation with Mr. Long and about 60 days before the fire, Fiorenzo Giannutullo had a conversation with the Sodders about insurance, and according to the report, Giannutullo told the Sodders, "I see you have refused to take out insurance and refused to sign the papers to settle Mrs. Sodder's father's estate. Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. Also, you are going to be paid back for the dirty remarks you have made about Mussolini." So, that's not standoffish or vague. That's pretty clear.
That sounds like a direct threat.
Absolutely. But Giannutullo was never questioned about these remarks, even though really he had accurately predicted what would happen to the Sodder house and some of the Sodder children. He also had that financial interest in what happened to the house. And now we know he had a motive to seek revenge in relation to the Mussolini comments made by George.
And then there's one other strange incident, and that was the appearance of a man in a black car parked along the road near the entrance to the Sodder property. He seemed to be watching the children as they got off the school bus in the afternoons. Nothing was said or done about this because he never approached the kids, but the Sodders did notice the man parked there several times.
So on Christmas Eve, none of these strange events were on the minds of Jennie or George, of course. George and his sons had spent the afternoon making food and freight deliveries to local businesses, and they were tired when they got home in the early evening. By 6 p.m., the oldest daughter, Mary Ann, had arrived home from her job at a department store, and she brought back gifts for the younger children. And as was the family custom, they were allowed to open a few of the gifts that night. So Jennie and George went to bed in their room on the first floor. They took the 3-year-old with them because they kept her crib in their room. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, one for the girls and one for the boys. The oldest boys, John and Ted, were in the boys' room by 11 or 11:30 p.m., but they wouldn't remember if the other boys came to bed while they were still awake. Before Jennie went to bed, 5 of the children asked her if they could stay up to play with their new toys and listen to the radio. So she told them that they could as long as they finished their chores before going upstairs to bed. Their chores included closing the curtains and locking the doors. And the 2 boys, Maurice and Louis, also had the job of feeding the cows and closing up the chicken coop for the night. So the 5 children who stayed up were Jennie, Louis, Maurice, Martha Lee, and Betty. Mary Ann stayed up as well, reading magazines while the children played. But she ended up falling asleep on the sofa in the living room, even though she normally slept in the upstairs bedroom with the other girls. One of her chores was to make sure the small children went upstairs to bed.
Yeah, she beat him to it. She fell asleep before.
She fell asleep, yeah.
Then around 12:30 in the morning, Mrs. Sodder was woken up by the telephone ringing in their home office. Accounts of this call would vary, but it was generally believed that the caller was a woman asking for someone the Sodders didn't know. Mrs. Sodder told the woman that the person they were looking for was not there. There are other accounts of this conversation. They say that Mrs. Sodder told the caller they had the wrong number. The woman apologized for disturbing her. Mrs. Sodder accepted the apology and hung up. Just before she hung up, she said that a man in the background laughed or made a similar sound. And then there's other accounts saying that the woman let out a strange laugh. And others have said that she heard laughter and glasses clinking in the background like there's a party going on.
So after Mrs. Sodder hung up from this phone call, she noticed that Mary Ann was asleep on the sofa. So she assumed that the other children had gone to bed themselves, and she decided not to wake up Mary Ann. She checked the fire in the coal stoves, and there were only some hot ashes left in the stove in the living room. She also noticed that the children had not done their chores, but she decided not to make them come back down and do them. Instead, she just did them herself. This was a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life, because it would have answered the question of whether or not the children were still in the house then. She didn't go outside to check on the outside chores, but she left the living room light on for Mary Ann in case she woke up and decided to go upstairs to bed at some point. So it was just about 30 minutes after returning to bed when Mrs. Sodder heard what sounded like a rock or a hard rubber ball hitting the roof and rolling off to the gutter. That part of the roof was tin, so it made a very distinct sound. Since the sound didn't happen again, though, she went back to sleep. She was tired. A large metals plant nearby had a bus that they would send out each night to take workers to the plant and back home. One of their routes passed by the Sodders' house on the night of the fire. There was a man on this bus who would become a witness. He said that as he was passing the house, he saw what appeared to be fireballs being rolled onto the roof of the house. So there's a witness that would indicate arson.
Sure would be.
When Mrs. Sodder woke up again at 1 a.m., she smelled smoke. When she opened their bedroom door, there was even heavier smoke in the hallway. When she ran down the hall, she saw a sheet of flames from the corner office and all around the telephone. She would describe the fire as being so hot that she couldn't touch the phone. Then she ran toward her bedroom and screamed for everyone to wake up, yelling that the house was on fire. The light in the living room was still on, she said. George Sodder would agree and said that the still burning lights had helped the family members who did survive to escape the house. So he tried to call the fire department, but their phone was dead.
Mary Ann heard her mother screaming and went into their bedroom, getting Sylvia out of the crib and out of the house. Sylvia was put in a truck cab to keep her safe. Then Mary Ann realized that she had not seen any of the other children come downstairs. George thought he might be able to put out the fire, and he ran out the kitchen door to the rain barrels at the bottom of the house gutters. But, like we had said, it was very cold that night, and the barrels were all frozen solid.
So next, Mrs. Sodder ran to the bottom of the stairs where she saw the two oldest boys at the top of the stairs. By this time, the fire was spreading quickly. The two oldest boys, who'd been sleeping in the same bed, said that they had called the other children on their way down. But this would become one of the most controversial parts of this story. In the first statements taken by the West Virginia State Police the next morning, John Sodder said that he was calling out to the other children. He thought that they were asleep, but he was sure he had heard a reply from one of the younger boys. But in another account, John said that he had actually shook his brothers to get them up. Later, though, when questioned more, John said that he had been mistaken or that he had been misquoted about Louis and Maurice. Now, there'd be a lot of speculation about that as well. Did John just say he shook the boys because he felt like he should have done that?
Yeah, right.
Right? Just because he felt guilty. There's going to be a lot of survivor's guilt in this family.
I can imagine.
So those two oldest boys made it down the stairs and out the front door. John said that they first went down the stairs without trying to carry the younger boys because they thought they could go down and put the fire out. Then, about halfway down, they realized that there was no way they could return to the second floor. So that was just horrific. A Sodder family member saw the scars of the fire on Ted's hands. Also, Ted and John had singed hair. The fire really had been right on top of them as they fled the house, and there was no way they could run back in. So once the family had gathered together outside, they realized that 5 of the children were not with them. Mr. and Mrs. Sodder attempted to get back in, but were blocked by the flames. Mr. Sodder then tried to get back in by breaking a window, but flames stopped him. In the process of breaking the window, he cut his arm pretty badly on the glass. But at that point, he didn't care. He went and looked for the ladder that was normally kept beside the house as he screamed for the children. He was hoping to get them to come to a window and jump out to him. Unable to find the ladder and becoming more and more desperate, George actually tried to climb up the side of the house. Of course, that was impossible. Then George and John thought of using their trucks as a way to get up to the second floor. There were 2 trucks, and each of them tried to start one of them, but neither truck would start. Now, both had worked fine the day before because George and the older boys had worked and used those trucks.
So I'm wondering if this is an attempt to kill people.
Right.
You know, you've moved the ladder.
Yep.
And both trucks that were functioning the day before wouldn't start.
I know. I would really love it if there's a report where they really inspected these vehicles to see if anything was done to them. It was a cold night, but they'd worked the day before.
Yep.
So, yeah, that would be very suspicious.
Now, meanwhile, Mary Ann ran next door to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Garfield Davis. Mrs. Davis attempted to contact the Fayetteville Fire Department by phone, but she couldn't get the switchboard operator to respond, and she never did reach the fire department.
Another suspicious thing. It was just around 1 a.m., and a 55-year-old farmer named Thomas E. Smith drove near the house and smelled the smoke. He drove past and he searched for a phone to call someone for help. He ended up stopping at a nearby bar and tried to use their phone, but it was out of order. Some of the patrons decided they were going to leave the bar and go watch the fire. Thomas Smith turned around and went back to Fayetteville, where he was able to contact the fire chief by phone. Fire Chief Maurice said that he already knew about the fire. When Smith asked Maurice if they were going to respond to the fire, Maurice answered, "I don't know." So Smith told the chief that there were children trapped in the fire, trying to tell him, this is pretty urgent. But Maurice didn't even reply to that. So disgusted, Smith drove back to the Sodder house to see if he could help. But by then, nobody could help.
At some point during the fire, Mr. Sodder, or maybe another family member, noticed Lonnie Johnson in their garage. This is separate from the house. Johnson was found stealing a set of chain hoists from the ceiling of the building. And later on it was determined that Johnson, possibly with the assistance of his partner, Dave Atkins, did steal 1 or 2 sets of chain hoists. Johnson later admitted that he took the hoists and threw them off a nearby embankment so he could come back and get them later.
So, I don't know a lot about chain hoists, but I think those are big, heavy things.
They're big, heavy things.
They're used to lift trucks and cars. Several days after the fire, Mr. Sodder got warrants for the 2 men to be arraigned for larceny. Johnson didn't appear for his hearing and was later arrested. Eventually, he pled guilty to the charges and paid a $25 fine. Atkins left the area and joined the Army to avoid prosecution, and he would end up spending the next 2 years in the Army. The fire department had no loud fire alarm. It is assumed that Chief Maurice initiated Fayetteville's phone tree system, where one firefighter phones another, who phones another, and so on. It wasn't until hours later that morning when Maurice showed up with just 3 other firemen. By the time Thomas Smith got back to the Sodder house, there were spectators gathering outside. The house had been consumed by the fire pretty much completely, and the surviving family members stood helplessly watching the entire house collapse. So they believed at this time that their 5 children were in that fire. The Sodders would take shelter in a small roadside shed. And later, Mrs. Sodder, Marianne, and Sylvia were taken to Mrs. Sodder's parents' house in Smithers, which was about 25 miles away. Many of Fayetteville's volunteer firemen were still away for the war at this point. There were others who had left town for the holiday. The firemen who were still in town were asleep, and most still didn't have telephones. So they had to be reached in person. Once they were finally contacted, it had taken about 7 hours for them to be at the site of the fire, which was only 2.5 miles from town. So they're estimated to have arrived at about 9 a.m., well after the house had been destroyed. But it was a long time to wait for firemen. Let's just say that.
So they hooked up a pump to a nearby creek and extinguished the remaining embers. Chief Maurice's reasons why it took them so long varied depending on the source. First, it was said that since it was Christmas, he had trouble waking enough men to answer the call. He also said that the snowstorm from the night before was too severe to take the truck out. Interestingly, several cars, a taxi driver, and a bus had driven by the house that night.
Right, so how had they done it?
Maurice also claimed that the Sodder house was out of the jurisdiction of his department. He didn't go until he found someone who knew how to drive the fire truck, because he didn't know how to.
That's crazy.
Well, he's just the chief. He can get other people to drive it.
Right.
But that just sounds like such a weak excuse.
Yeah, they were all volunteers and not really on top of things.
Yeah, I like it's out of my jurisdiction. Too bad. It's got to burn.
Yeah, well, that guy really does sound like an asshole. We'll find out more about him. So we know that the missing Sodder children were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. These were the 5 kids who had asked to stay up and play with their toys in the living room. The rest of the family stayed in a shelter that morning, and George Sodder was taken to the hospital for treatment of his lacerated arm. The first officials to reach the site after the fire department were 2 West Virginia state troopers. Their names were R.W. Rule and F.E. Springer. The original report from Trooper Rule said that they had arrived at the fire at about 9:15 and learned that the fire had happened at about 1:30 a.m. and that 5 members of the family were found in a building near the fire where they were interviewed. As soon as the debris was cool enough, a search was done to try and find the remains of the 5 children and hopefully determine the cause of the fire. It is stated in the fire marshal's report that several members of the volunteer search party quit in disgust because of the way they were being ordered around by Chief Maurice, and they were just tired of his attitude. So this report states that the search ended at 10 a.m., so that's barely a cursory search.
Yeah, it seems like under an hour.
Right, and by today's standards, a situation like that, they would take days searching. So at this point, Chief Maurice went to where Mr. Sodder and his family were in that small building, and he told them that the searchers had made a thorough search of the debris and no trace of the remains of their children were found. Mrs. Sodder responded that that was impossible, but Maurice added that they had searched the area with a fine-tooth comb and had found nothing. But now, in 1968, 23 years after this fire, Maurice was quoted in an article in Inside Detective magazine saying that he looked thoroughly where the beds would have been, but didn't finish the search to his satisfaction because he heard that Mr. Sodder was going to cover it with dirt. But most accounts say it was Chief Maurice who first suggested filling in the basement as a cemetery for the children. But in a 1950 report, it states that Chief Maurice and the other searchers would have found the children's remains if they had been there. In a story in the Fayette Tribune the day after Christmas 1945, it states that part of one body was found. But 2 days later, in an article in the Beckley Post-Herald, it stated that a few bones were found. It would turn out that both of these were incorrect.
Yeah, Maurice told George Sodder to leave the site undisturbed so the state fire marshal's office could do a more thorough investigation. But after 4 days, George and Jennie couldn't bear looking at it anymore. So George bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden. So I guess you could say there might still be bones there, but they're buried.
Oh, absolutely there could be. But you really can't blame George. He waited 4 days for them to come back, and nobody came back.
I'm not blaming George. I'm just trying to figure out what happened to the 5 kids.
Well, join the club. Everybody's trying to figure that out. That's the big question. So the local coroner did an inquest after that and decided that the fire was an accident that had been caused by faulty wiring. But one of the jurors in this inquest was actually the man who had threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates were issued for the 5 children just days later on December 30th. The local newspaper contradicted itself then, stating that all of the bodies had been found, and then later stating that only one part of one body was found. So this whole thing is a mess.
It is. But you're going back to the beginning where the fire was raging. It took forever to get the fire department there.
That's true.
And you got 5 missing kids.
I just don't think that they could have burned completely.
You know, I mean, down to dust? No.
No, and there had to be part of a skull or the hip bones, one of those big, thick bones.
And this fire might have been going pretty heavily.
It might have.
But it doesn't get hot enough, I don't think, to burn the bones.
Well, you wouldn't think so.
Crematorium, you need 2,000 degrees for 3 to 4 hours, something like that.
I don't remember exactly what it was, but most people thought it was more than this fire did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as the remaining members of the Sodder family were trying to rebuild their lives, Jennie and George began to question the official findings. They wondered why, if the fire had been caused by an electrical problem, the Christmas lights had stayed on while the fire was burning. Shouldn't the power have gone out? Then they found their ladder that had been missing from the side of the house. It was at the bottom of an embankment, 75 feet away. That's one of the most suspicious things to me, is the ladder.
Yeah, well, they knew that the telephone line had been cut.
Well, we're going to find that out. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through, but had been cut. So that's why the phone wasn't working. In 1968, the Charleston Gazette-Mail reported that the man who had stolen the block and chain admitted to the theft and said that he had cut the telephone wires to the house because he thought they were power lines, which would have had to happen shortly before the fire because remember the call from a wrong number around midnight. So there's only like an hour from that call to when the fire was discovered.
Right. The newspaper pointed out that the telephone lines had been cut 14 feet above the ground and 2 feet away from a telephone pole. Apparently no one believed that the thief had cut the wires.
Well, either way, he said that he had nothing to do with the fire. But the ladder would have had to be used if they were 14 feet above the ground, cutting it.
Yeah.
So the coroner's inquest was held at the site to determine the cause of death. Maybe because the verdict seemed to be obvious, the local justice of the peace acted as coroner, and the county prosecutor oversaw the inquest. By holding the first inquest at the site, less than 12 hours after the fire, it seems that they had no intent to do any more investigation, to interview witnesses, or hear any testimony, really. Even though Mrs. Sodder said that she believed the fire had been intentionally set, they decided it was accidental, and this decision came in only 2 days after the fire.
Fire Chief Maurice claimed 2 years later that he did, in fact, find evidence of the Sodder's dead children that morning. Specifically, he found a heart, which he buried in a sealed dynamite box on the property. It just strains my belief.
Oh, yeah.
Heart's a muscle.
This guy's not believable.
How is that going to survive a fire? This fire leveled the house and burned up skeletons.
Right.
So it's just nuts that he claimed to have found a heart.
It is nuts.
Rather than bones.
Absolutely, it's nuts. He was talked into showing the family the spot where there was a box, and they brought it to the funeral home in Montgomery. When the funeral director opened the box, he found what looked like a fresh beef liver. Maurice then said that yes, he did make it up, but only so the Sodders would stop looking for their children.
Yeah, I did it for their sake.
So maybe he did this because he had actually found remains the morning after the fire and wanted to cover up that he had either ignored them or thrown them out to spare the Sodders from seeing their children's remains. But I think that's a stretch. And if this were the case, he really didn't save them any suffering. I think he caused them a lot of suffering over the years. So in the final report issued by the West Virginia State Police in January 1946, the cause of the fire is listed as undetermined. It goes on to say that the fire started either from defective wiring at the place where the electric wire entered the house, or from spontaneous igniting of combustibles in the basement. So the second possibility was based on George Sodder using the basement as a workshop for dismantling and repairing truck motors. But Mr. Sodder denied having any large quantities of gas and truck tires stored in the basement. The state police would later change this determination and say that the fire had probably started on the roof of the house. And that will make you remember the noise on the tin roof that Jennie heard.
That's right. On the morning of the fire, around 10, Mrs. Sodder's brother, Jimmy Cipriani, came to the scene of the fire. He said he had been called by Mr. Giannutulo. It's believed that Jimmy had brought along his son, Joseph, who was seen comforting George. In a 1950 fire marshal report, it says that some Italian unknown to him showed him something in a tub on paper, which appeared to him to be several joints of a backbone, about 16 inches long, and possibly part of a liver. It says that the piece of flesh appeared to have been attached to the bones, but the person who showed it to him made no comment and gave no explanation.
Well, Reverend James Frame arrived at the scene early on the morning of the fire, and he tried to comfort the family. He would be interviewed and stated that he went to the fire scene and prayed with the family. While at the scene, he said, one of the searchers handed him a part of an internal organ that was about the size of a fist. It looked like a waterlogged lung to him. He said he put the mass on a piece of stovepipe near the scene and left it there. He didn't stay long because it was really cold out. The Sodders became convinced that their children had not died. They couldn't find any evidence that their children had been present during that fire, aside from John having said that he tried to shake them awake before later contradicting this. For them to be carried out of the house and held against their will for that many years does seem really implausible, because they could have escaped their captors at some point. If they grew up and had children of their own, for them never to try and contact the family is hard to believe.
Well, it's hard to believe that you can get 5 kids. I mean, then you'd have to have more than one person.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, you would.
Yes, that's a tough story to believe.
It is. Jennie read an article about a fire in a similar 3-story frame house. All 7 skeletons were found, even that of a 3-month-old. So she began conducting her own experiments in which she tried to burn chicken, cow, and pig bones. But no matter what she did, the bones always remained. An employee at a nearby crematorium told her that they burned bodies at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours. So that's kind of what you thought. Pretty close.
Yeah.
And she said that even after that, some bones will remain. So now, as time goes on, Jennie and George are really wondering what really happened.
Yeah.
They can't get a straight answer from anyone.
No, they can't. Now, here's some more info to play with. After the snow began to thaw in the spring, Sylvia was playing outdoors when she found a hard rubber object, military green in color, and hollow with a twist-off cap in the garden. Now, Army authorities reportedly identified that as a napalm bomb called a pineapple bomb.
Yeah, the Sodders tried to get help from the FBI, too, and they received a letter from Director J. Edgar Hoover. In the letter, Hoover said, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of a local character and does not come with the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." Now, the local police and fire department refused to let the FBI assist, so nothing more came of that. In August of 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, the Sodders brought in a pathologist, Oscar B. Hunter, to excavate and examine the scene. Although they found some objects, a damaged coin, part of a burned dictionary, and some shards of vertebrae, they did not find any proof that the children had died there. So the Sodders sent the bone shards off to be tested by the Smithsonian, which said that the vertebrae belonged to a male between 16 and 22 years old. Too old to be any of the children because the oldest was 14. So do you agree with that? Is that a very specific thing?
I don't know what kind of testing they would do, but it seems very difficult to narrow it down to someone between 16 and 22.
Yeah, when 14 doesn't seem that far off.
No.
But another interesting thing is that these pieces of vertebrae had never been exposed to fire, so that makes no sense.
Nope.
Since the house was stated to have burned for half an hour or so, they would expect to find full skeletons of all 5 children rather than 4 vertebrae. Per Smithsonian Magazine, the doctors stated, "It is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful evacuation of the basement of the house. It was concluded then that the bones were most likely in the soil that George had used to create the memorial garden." Now, I'm not sure of that. I guess the fact that it hadn't been exposed to fire, though, makes it impossible that it belonged to any of the children.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Well, how could it be? Because the flesh would have had to been burned off of it, so there would be some kind of...
There would be evidence that some burning had taken place.
Absolutely, right. So I don't even count that as anything definitive.
George and Jennie not only believed that their children were alive, but they believed that the fire was arson. There were theories of the 5 children being kidnapped from the living room before the fire was started. The door had been unlocked, and the older children were upstairs. But Mary Ann had been there, sleeping, but down with the other kids.
Yeah, she was on the sofa there.
Yeah, so again, I can't picture people coming into that house, taking the 5 kids, and leaving Mary Ann.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it is a long shot, unless they were lured outside by someone. We don't know how soundly Mary Ann slept.
But it's really freezing outdoors, so people aren't going to be hanging outdoors for a long time.
Oh, no, not for a long time. No. I'm just thinking of the car that was seen parked near the house watching the children. And that makes me wonder if that was someone who had their eye on them.
Yeah, and what's the motive? Ransom?
There's so many motives. No, there was no ransom. But there are a lot of motives, and we'll go over them. I bet you could name a couple right now off the top of your head.
Well, no, I'm talking about motives for kidnapping 5 kids.
Yes, I'm agreeing with you on that.
I guess you could say one possible thing was they were going to sell them.
One.
And maybe they would have extorted money from Sodders.
Well, I don't believe that, because I believe that whoever kidnapped the children, if that's the case, would have been the same person to start the fire.
I'll go with that.
So after 2 hearings were held in the Capitol in Charleston, Governor Oki L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders that their search was hopeless and declared the case closed. Still unconvinced, George and Jennie put up a billboard along Route 16 and passed out flyers offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of their children. They soon increased the amount of the reward to $10,000. So this billboard, which became pretty famous in the area, read, "What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive?" And then it gives details about the night they disappeared. Some questions are brought up, like why there had been no odor of burning flesh. And they also questioned the motive of law enforcement officers that might be involved, and what they gained by the Sodders' suffering. And the most important issue, why were there no remains? So the sign was actually like a local landmark. The reward caused George and Jennie to receive frequent calls with mostly bogus tips. The sightings included a woman who claimed to have seen the missing children peering at her from inside a passing car while the fire was still in progress. So there's one. Ida Crutchfield, a motel operator in Charleston, said that she had seen the children a week after they disappeared. Crutchfield called the 2 men escorting the children hostile. The men spoke rapidly, she said, in Italian, and they left the next morning. She'd only seen pictures of the missing Sodders, though, 2 years after the fire, so her sighting was not viewed as credible, but she said that she'd seen 4 children. Then there was a woman operating a tourist shop 50 miles from Fayetteville, and she told police that she served them breakfast. She said there was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court, too. But the problem is this car might not even have been theirs. There may be no connection at all. So kind of another weak tip. The Sodders received a letter from a woman in St. Louis claiming that Martha was in a convent there. In Texas, a barfly was sure he'd heard people talking about setting a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. Down in Florida, the children were supposedly staying with Jennie's relatives. And a Houston woman said a man she knew drunkenly confessed to being Lewis. When George got there, the man said that he was not Lewis, and he obviously was not. So a lot of these were just attempts to get the money.
Oh, sure.
So when that really didn't turn out very well, they hired a private investigator. This guy was named C.C. Tinsley.
Yeah, he's the guy that told the Sodders that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was a member of the coroner's jury that had deemed the fire accidental.
So that's interesting.
That's very interesting. So over the years, the tips and leads continued to come in. George saw a newspaper photo of schoolchildren in New York City and was convinced that one of them was his daughter Betty. He drove to Manhattan to see her, but her parents refused to speak to him.
In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jennie went out to get the mail and she found an envelope addressed only to her. It was postmarked in Kentucky but had no return address, and inside was a photo of a man in his mid-20s. On its flip side, a cryptic handwritten note said, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, LLIL boys, A90132 or 35. So, just as to us, this meant nothing to the Sodders, and they didn't even have a Frankie in their family. So Jennie and George couldn't deny the resemblance to their son Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire. Beyond the obvious similarities, dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, they had the same straight, strong nose and the same upward tilt of the left eyebrow. Again, they hired a private detective and sent him out to Kentucky, but they never heard from him again. So this must have been a guy that just ran off with their money. But still, just getting that photo did give them some hope. They added it to the billboard, and they put a copy of it over their fireplace. But this would be the final lead that they would ever get.
Yeah, in 1968, George Sodder spoke to the Charleston Gazette-Mail, admitting we can't go any farther with the search. Time is running out for us, he said, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. In 1969, George Sodder died.
Yeah, now Jennie was never able to move forward without knowing what had happened to her children. She actually dressed in black for the rest of her life and spent her days tending the memorial garden at the site of the fire. When Jennie died in 1989, the remaining Sodder children finally removed the billboard from the side of the highway. So after the fire, the Sodders really had begun to believe their children hadn't died in the fire due to many of these strange happenings. According to Bob Lane Bragg, who wrote an entire book on the Sodder children, the final straw was the supposed human organ, referred to as a mass, which was found and then buried at the site of the fire. So there are actually two versions of what happened. In the first version, nothing was initially found after the fire was extinguished, but the Fayetteville fire chief admitted that he did find a mass later that day. But the second report in 1957 contradicts the original version. On the morning of the fire, after searching the debris for an hour or two, Fire Chief Maurice told the Sodders that no remains could be found. Then 4 days after the fire, Mr. Sodder turned that black hole into a memorial for the children, filling it with 5 to 6 feet of dirt. He did this because he concluded that no one was coming back to investigate further, as they said that they would. Also, at this point, they were still convinced that the children had died in the fire. Also, he'd filled the hole because the time of the funeral was coming up, and he really didn't want friends and family there staring into a black hole in the ground during the ceremony. He felt like filling it gave some dignity to the memories of his children.
Then, according to a 1950 report, around mid-July in 1947, a year or so after the fire, Reverend Frame heard that the fire chief was telling people around town that he had actually found something in the ashes. He was describing the object he found as a human heart. It was reported that the Reverend told the chief that the human heart would resist fire. Maurice told Frame that he had placed the mass in a wooden cartridge box and buried it in the debris. So, thinking that this was important for the Sodders to know about, Frame contacted George and Jennie and told them about the conversation he had had with the chief.
Yeah, but what is not in the report is that it was around the same time when the Sodders were becoming less satisfied with the conclusions regarding what had really happened to their children. The Sodders had hired a private eye to explore any leads into a possible kidnapping of the children. After hearing what the fire chief had said, they didn't understand why it had taken a year and a half for the chief to say anything about this. And why had the chief not spoken directly to them? When Mrs. Sodder called the fire chief and asked him to come to the scene to show them where he had buried the so-called heart, he came but didn't tell them that he was there. Mrs. Sodder called him again, and he told her that he had placed a stake in the ground where the box containing the heart had been buried. So this was really odd because the new Sodder home was only about 100 feet from the site of the fire. Maurice hadn't bothered to come to their door to speak to them. So this behavior was really strange considering the sensitivity of the situation, that you just kind of sneak over there and put a stick in the ground.
Yeah.
Very strange. It's unknown how many phone calls were made to him before Maurice finally showed up for a face-to-face meeting about this. And once he was there, the Sodders asked him why he hadn't told them about the heart before. But Maurice didn't even apologize. He simply answered that he had thought he had told them, but maybe he didn't. After Maurice admitted to everyone that he had found some remains, George Sodder, the private eye, and the private eye's brother met at the site, but any police official or fire official were absent. The men spent the morning digging up the box from the place where Maurice had left a stake, and Maurice did show up while the digging was being done, and the box was found under a piece of tin at the bottom of the basement. Maurice was questioned and offered no explanation for his weird and apparently secret handling of that mass. He had been at the inquest and had not even mentioned it then. He claimed he'd said nothing because he wasn't asked. What do you think of that? It's nuts.
It's laughable.
Well, it's laughable. If it was your children, though, you wouldn't think it was very damn funny.
I sure wouldn't.
The guy's a real jerk. So if this was the end of the story, that was strange enough, but no, the story continued. The mass that was dug up was taken to the funeral home for a mortician to examine and identify. The mortician wasn't told the situation surrounding the mass or what it supposedly was. He opened the box and took out the mass, which was wrapped in newspaper. He found no bones or hard objects in the box. The mass weighed 4 or 5 pounds. His opinion was that it was a portion of a beef liver which had never been exposed to heat. It was well preserved and not decayed. So the mass was put in a jar of embalming fluid, put back into the box, and left outside on the back porch because it smelled bad. It was mid-July and really warm out, and it was 10 days later when the private eye called and said he would pick up the box. But he didn't show up again, and by the time he arrived, the box was gone from the porch. So the fact that the box had turned up missing after it had been left outside isn't incredibly mysterious because it's believed that it might have been picked up during regular trash pickup. It smelled bad like trash, and back then in that part of West Virginia, there was no rule that trash had to be bagged for pickup. So they'd just come over to the porch and grab whatever was trash and throw it in the truck.
The second version of the story comes primarily from a report by the State Fire Marshal's Office on January 25, 1952. Now, the reason for this second report isn't clear, but it could have been due to George Sodder's insistence that the case be reopened. In this report, Reverend Frame now claimed that on the morning of the fire, after he had led the Sodder family in prayer, one of the searchers handed him an internal organ about the size of a fist. He placed it on a section of stovepipe lying nearby. Prosecuting attorney was also interviewed, and he said he saw a mass of internal organs, and he told Chief Maurice to dispose of the remains.
How is that possible? You find the remains of a fire victim? You don't throw them away, not even in the 40s.
No.
It's just so crazy.
He claimed that he saw the remains on the same morning as the fire.
Right. But another difference in this version is that Maurice said he poured water on the fire for 2 hours before being able to search for the remains. This was twice the amount of time claimed in the 1950 report. In the 1952 report, Reverend Frame had described the basement as a raging inferno. But in the 1950 report, Maurice had said there were just some burning embers when he arrived. So since these two reports were 18 months apart, you might think that they were either mistaken or had given false information. But since the 1950 report had indicated that no remains had been found, it is doubly suspicious. But the overall theme is that the police and fire marshal's office had already made up their minds that the children had died in the fire, and that was pretty much the end of it in their minds.
Yep.
So let's assume that the mass was a piece of beef liver that had not been exposed to fire. And so that means that someone, probably Maurice, brought a piece of liver to the fire. Mrs. Sodder said in the report that she did not have any liver or organ meats in her house and that they had not butchered any livestock before the fire. So why in the hell would he bring a beef liver to the fire?
I don't know. If you're thinking there's some conspiracy going on here, and Maurice is part of it, I still don't know what the heck that piece of beef liver was going to do for them.
Yeah, well, he claimed that he wanted to spare them because he thought it was a body part. But we know it wasn't a body part. We know it had to be brought to the fire, and it did not have any fire damage. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's many things here that make you think conspiracy.
Yes.
So some possible explanations for why no bones from the children were found, especially large bones like skulls and pelvic bones, are the location of the remains relative to the hottest point of the fire, the availability of fuel in the home, the type of fuel in the home, the time exposed to the heat, the contact with water, and the overall temperature of the fire. But still, for all 5 bodies to be burnt to ash, all of these conditions would have to fall just right. So the odds of that are really astronomical.
I would think.
So there's no easy explanation here.
No, there isn't. But for the sake of argument, let's speculate that coal, wood, rubber tires, gasoline, and all the other material a house with wood and coal-burning stoves would have, they were all present. To incinerate all of the bones, all of the bodies would have had to have landed in a certain area of the basement where all of these fuels were present together in the basement. But if the heat had been enough to incinerate 5 bodies, the bricks and mortar of the chimneys would have been burnt to dust. It still comes down, at least partially, as to whether or not the site had been thoroughly searched.
Well, of course, there's no direct evidence that the children were kidnapped, or even that the Sodder home was intentionally set on fire. but there's plenty of circumstantial evidence. For many years, people talked about the possible involvement of the mafia. There was a significant element of organized crime in Fayette County at the time, and George Sodder had received what they call a black hand letter. So oftentimes this threatening letter with a coal-blackened handprint is put on a victim's door with a threat for extortion. Kidnapping, murder, arson, and dynamite were all calling cards of this organization. The Sodder family was well respected and liked, but George had strong anti-Mussolini views and was against the fascist government in his Italian homeland. In Fayetteville, many of the families were also Italian immigrants who disagreed strongly with George's views. Also, the coal trucking business was under pressure from the Sicilian mafia, and George was aware of this. A few weeks before the fire, the Sodder children had noticed a strange man in a car watching them as they returned home from school. So if the fire was intentional, and if the children were kidnapped, how could it have happened? So that's basically what you've been asking me.
Yes. Now you're going to tell me.
Well, here's my idea. The parents had gone to bed with 3-year-old Sylvia at 9 p.m., right? Then the 2 older boys went upstairs about an hour later. Mary Ann was asleep on the sofa where the 5 younger children were playing. Then Mrs. Sodder answered a phone call at 12:30. At that point, she'd assumed the 5 young children had gone off to bed. Mary Ann was still on the sofa, but Mrs. Sodder locked the doors then and pulled the curtains. So before entering the house, if there were kidnappers, they would have cut the phone line using the ladder. Then they'd move the ladder so it couldn't be used to rescue anyone from the fire. So this person could have been Lonnie Johnson and David Atkins, or one or the other, but definitely Lonnie Johnson is a suspect. Someone had to have arranged to have the children taken away. So it's possible they were taken out of the house sometime between when Mary Ann fell asleep and when Mrs. Sodder got up to answer the phone. It's even been brought up that maybe they came and took the children while she was on the phone. Maybe the phone call was a diversion. Of course, there'd be no proof of that either, though. So it's possible that someone could have opened the unlocked door and lured the children outside, maybe by saying that Santa Claus was out there and they needed to be quiet and, not scare the reindeer away. So that would explain why the children who were playing in the living room were the 5 who disappeared. In this scenario, the children never did go upstairs to bed. So once the kidnappers had the children out of the house was set on fire by rolling flaming Molotov cocktails onto the roof. Then the call could have been made to warn the family before the fire was started, especially if it wasn't meant to kill anybody. But if all 5 were taken, the oldest boy, Maurice, who was 14, may have fought and then been killed by the kidnappers. And that could explain why Ida Crutchfield of the hotel in Charleston only saw 4 children with the 2 Italian men and 2 Italian women. Then the remaining 4 children may have been threatened that if they talked to the rest of the family or said anything, their whole family would be killed.
So remember that the fire department gave several excuses why it took several hours to get 3 firemen the 2.5 miles to the burning house. But this is typical of Black Hand techniques, allowing the fire to burn itself out to give the appearance that the children burned up completely. Some people suggested that Maurice had left the beef liver to give the Sodders comfort in thinking that the children had died in the fire, but placing a liver in the ashes could have been a symbolic message of revenge. It had been left at scenes before as an Italian message. The feast of life has been taken from you, and all you have left is liver. Now eat your heart out in grief for the rest of your life. Or either way, it just doesn't add up.
No, because he didn't tell the Sodders about the Mass, and the Sodders knew nothing about it as remains or as a symbol of revenge, so that wouldn't even have worked. There is the persistent question that if the children were kidnapped, why wouldn't they have come back when they got older? In a traditional kidnapping, if money is paid, the kidnapped victims are supposed to be released. But the structure of an old world vendetta was that they either couldn't come back, in other words, were murdered, or if they did survive, they were sold and told if they ever tried to return, their entire family would be killed. So to the Black Hand, the kidnapping of children was not personal at all, but it was a business, a way to make money or a way to get revenge. So if in this case it was for revenge, then there was never any intent to hurt the children or let the family know if they were alive or dead, because the thought of not knowing is considered to be much worse than outright killings. So the purpose would have been to inflict pain and to assert control over George Sodder. Then if we go ahead with our speculation on this kidnapping scenario, the remaining question is, well, whatever happened to the children? They could have been murdered within hours or days of being taken. And like you mentioned, Dick, the younger children could have been sold. Maurice likely would have resisted, so again, he may have been murdered. The other children could have been taken to another state or even back to Italy, sold, and placed with other families. The female children could even have been turned over to marriage brokers. So that's a horrible thought.
Yeah, and there were at least 3 suspected sightings of the Sodder children in the days after the fire. If any of them were true, whoever took the children was heading west. If they're taking them back to Italy, they would have headed east, not west. One private detective hired by Mr. Sodder was quoted in 1948, "The general public is not aware that there is a market for children. In large cities, they are sold for as much as $1,000. It's about $13,000 in today's money." He added that many people are willing to pay large sums of money for children in order to avoid the red tape of the adoption agencies. There were people around who made their living selling babies and young children. This wasn't widely recognized until years later, when the case of Georgia Tan and the Tennessee Children's Home Society made the headlines.
Yeah, we actually covered the Georgia Tan case back in 2017. Can you believe how long that was? We've been doing this a long time, Dickie.
That's 7 years ago.
So we did this. We titled the episode The Baby Thief. This is episode 110 in case anyone wants to go back and listen to it. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was started back in 1897, and it was a legitimate orphanage that took in abandoned and orphaned children and found parents for them. The adoptive parents paid a large fee for this, and Tan eventually turned to what she called helping poor families by taking their children. Then she would adopt them out without the parents' permission. So she claimed that poor people could not parent properly, and poor children needed to be rescued from their families. Yikes. Now, although Tan kept no records of the adoptions, it is estimated that between 1924 and 1950, she did facilitate more than 5,000 adoptions to wealthy clients from all over the country. Tan took in a lot of money, and in today's money, she had about $20 million. Now, even the worst part of this is that children who were unhealthy or mentally or physically disabled were often ignored and just left to die. Tan actually disposed of these bodies with help from a local funeral home and crematorium. So Tan died in 1950 from cancer, so she was never even prosecuted for her crimes. But she wouldn't have had any hesitation in taking in the kidnapped Sodder children if someone had brought them over to her.
More recently, Dr. Ramzi Amri, a researcher at Harvard Medical School, spoke on the case. He said, "Bones do not exactly melt. It's more falling apart, as they're very solid. For an entire skeleton to be destroyed in a fire, the temperature is required to burn at more than 850 degrees Fahrenheit consistently for at least 2 hours. Now, the Sodder family home was on fire for 45 minutes, as the wood-framed structure and wind speed that night meant the property did not stand a chance. And considering how long it took for the house to collapse, there should, in theory, still be skeletons of the 5 children in the debris. But, they were never recovered."
No. Most recent articles about the case concentrate on the conclusion that the children did not die in the fire. But there is just as much information that says that they did. Even though I think they may have died in the fire, there is enough strangeness about the events surrounding the fire and things that were not adequately investigated that it would not be shocking to me to learn that they actually didn't die that night. But of course, suspicions don't prove arson, kidnapping, or murder. So it kind of leaves us where we were in the beginning. Pointing toward their deaths in the fire is the fact that some remains were found, and also that the oldest son, John, said he went in and shook his brothers and sisters. But the family said that he had just said that out of guilt because he felt like that's what he should have done, which could be true. But it could also be true that he did what he said he did. Interestingly, John was the one family member who did believe his siblings had died in the fire and wanted to stop the search and take down the billboard.
Right. Unfortunately, the fire wasn't aggressively investigated at first because everyone was satisfied that the children had died in the fire. Once it became clear that the family thought the children were still alive, the state police and the fire marshal did investigate, except it's not known how thoroughly they investigated, particularly in the case of Mr. John Nutulo, who had insurance on the Sodder home. He was the only person who had a clear motive for arson, not the kidnapping, but he was rarely mentioned in the investigative reports.
No, it does seem likely that the children died because no one's heard of them again. If not that night, then maybe they died soon after. But then who started the fire? The phone call and the noise on the roof before Jennie woke up and found the fire are very suspicious. Then we also have the missing ladder, the phone line being cut, the theft on the property, and the trucks that wouldn't start. So if nothing else, I do think it was arson. It seems to me that the house was set on fire with some kind of incendiary device that was thrown onto the roof, and the phone line was cut to prevent the family from calling for help. It is the kind of crime that could be credited to the mafia, who George Sodder may have rebuffed and even insulted. The mafia could also have pressured the fire chief to discourage him from hurrying to the fire or investigating it thoroughly. They are also a group that could conceivably keep this secret for 75 years. They're known to be good at keeping secrets.
Omerta.
So the mystery continues. What do you think, Dickie?
I think that fire was arson, and I believe that the children perished in the fire.
So you must think their bones are down there somewhere and they just weren't found.
I think so. From what I know of this case, they didn't really go through the debris very, very thoroughly. And not long afterwards, Dad put 5 or 6 feet of dirt on top of it.
Yeah, that's true, but then that doesn't explain a lot of things.
Well, I don't have anything to explain it sufficiently, right?
No, nobody does. That's the problem. The beef liver, the moved ladder, there's just so many things that are very suspicious, and even arson doesn't explain all of them.
Yeah, you get a few threads here, a few threads there.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, we're going to move on to feedback now, but I would love to hear anyone's opinions or conclusions on this case, because a lot of our listeners are smarter than us, and will probably have some interesting opinions and ideas about this.
I would welcome the ideas.
Okay, so before we do feedback, my quick reminder of our premium option of TCB, where you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. There's at least one bonus case every month, and all of our regular shows will be ad-free if you subscribe. We also send our new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you note. You can subscribe right now while listening to feedback by going to tiegrabber.com/subscribe and get all TCB episodes both early and ad-free. Some other ways we would like to ask you to help the show is to give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen. Also, we'd love to get an email or a voicemail from you with a case suggestion or any ideas or comments on cases we've already covered. If you have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, and voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, Dickie, what is our first piece of feedback?
I have a voice message from Nate, who has an interesting case suggestion.
Hello, Dick and Jill. It's Nate, your biggest fan. I have another case to suggest to you guys. This has not been covered by a true crime podcast as of yet, I believe. Amy Locane is an actress. She's most famous, I think, for being in one season of Melrose Place. But she had a DUI motor vehicle homicide case in 2010. And going through plea bargaining, the sentence was like 3.5 years. But then the prosecutors thought, and the judge thought the sentence was too lenient. So they resentenced her to 8 years in prison. So she's still in prison now. But I thought it was an interesting case because normally, a celebrity might get a light sentence, but for that, the fact that she was resentenced is interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's, I don't think it's ever been covered as a true crime case, but I think it would be interesting to cover it because normally, celebrities get a break, in a case like that, or sometimes they get a break. But, it's interesting that she was resentenced because the judge and prosecutor felt it was too lenient, the deal they cut originally. So it's like, but yeah, I didn't know if you watched Melrose Place or whatever, but I sent a link to her Wikipedia to you guys. So it's in New Jersey. It's a Jersey case. But anyway, hope you guys are doing well. Hopefully it's not too hot in the Southwest. Anyway, cheers.
Thank you, Nate. That's an interesting case.
I think it's pretty rare, right, for a sentence to be changed like that? That's kind of striking.
And her attorneys said that it seemed like double jeopardy.
It does a bit, because once you've been convicted and sentenced, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but it's just interesting to me that they could actually change it like that. Kind of scary, because you might get sentenced to a couple of years and then they can come back and do that. Although I do agree that most celebrities do get, usually get an easy punishment.
Get some special treatment.
Usually. And sometimes they don't, but it does happen for sure. So we'll get into that, Nate.
A Jersey case.
Who cares if it's Jersey? All right. So we have an email from Klappenbach with a case suggestion. Klappenbach writes, I have a case suggestion about a 1987 unsolved murder case. I have listened to many of your podcasts and realize you do not showcase many unsolved cases, but am hoping you would take on this case. My cousin, Sandra Lynn Williams, 20 years old, left her home in Beebe, Arkansas on April 25, 1987, going to her boyfriend's house for a cookout around 4:30 p.m. The boyfriend only lived like 50 minutes away. Around 9 or 10 p.m. that night, the boyfriend contacted Sandra's mother and informed her that Sandra never showed up. Her car was abandoned on the side of the road close to Romance, Arkansas, which was on the route to her boyfriend's house. She was found 2 weeks later about 3.5 miles from her car in the woods, and she had been stabbed multiple times. I have listened to your podcasts for a few years now and love how you dig deep into the background of the suspect's upbringing and the victim's family history. You provide a lot of detail, which is interesting, and I also enjoy all your comments and banter back and forth. All right, well, thank you very much, Klappenbach. So we normally don't cover cases that people write in about their families or whatnot. Plus, we're not investigators. So I guess that's part of the reason we don't do a lot of unsolved cases. But for this kind of case, to me, it sounds like something for Kelly.
Oh, that's Kelly Siegler. So she's the cold justice lady. It's been a few years that we've been watching that. But back in her former life, she was a prosecuting attorney. And she prosecuted the guy we did that case, a football coach who murdered his wife, or was convicted of murdering his wife, I forget his name, from Katy, Texas. Anyway, we know her.
Sounds like a case they would be good at.
Yeah, probably.
Probably.
I mean, we could look and see how much information there is out there.
Well, we certainly can. I just don't want anyone to think we would solve a crime. We don't have any idea how to solve a crime.
No.
Okay, let's have you read the email from Amy with a case suggestion.
So Amy writes, after working a long New Year's Eve shift at the end of 2019, Rebecca Hogue, 28-year-old cocktail waitress, arrived home in Norman, Oklahoma around 4 a.m, and she went to check on her 2-year-old son. During work, she'd left her son Ryder with her boyfriend, Christopher Trent, who had put him to bed in his crib, where he appeared to be sleeping, and Hogue turned in for the night. But when she woke up a few hours later, Trent was gone, and her toddler, still in the crib, wasn't breathing. Panicked, she called 911. "Oh my God, he's cold," she told the operator. He was dead. In November, Hogue was convicted of first-degree murder, even though she never laid a hand on the boy. At a sentencing hearing, a judge will decide whether to send her to prison for life, as the jury recommended. Now, how's that possible?
That's just what I was going to ask.
Hogue was convicted under Oklahoma's failure to protect law, which requires parents to shield their kid from physical harm if they're aware or should have been aware that another adult is abusing the child. Now, the judge sentenced her to 16 months in prison with credit for time served. So that means she will not serve any additional time. The jury had recommended a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Now, some people believe Hogue should not have been charged at all.
Well, it's hard to say not knowing all the details, right? I would think there's probably more to it where the child showed signs of long-term abuse, like bones that had been broken and healed, old bruises, injuries like that, perhaps.
Yeah, there has to be something in there that makes it that the parent was aware of or should have been aware of mistreatment of the child.
Yeah, but you do hear often about when women leave their child with their boyfriend. The boyfriend does something to the child. It's I wouldn't say it's common, but it's a crime that we hear about fairly often.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so we don't know, though, if she knew anything about it. So if she did not know that the boyfriend was doing something horrible to her boy, I can't imagine her getting a life sentence. No, that just seems really crazy. But it is really fascinating, and I'm going to look into it more. So thanks, Amy. So before we say goodbye, I just wanted to mention one final thing, and that's the Jinx Season 2. So when the first Jinx documentary came out, it said it was the best documentary series ever. And I think it was. What do you think?
It's in my top 5.
Yeah, it was amazing. So now, anyway, we have the Jinx 2, and I was kind of wondering, do we need that? We already heard everything that happened, right? That's kind of the best ending. You should leave it at that. But now we're watching Season 2, and it's really good, too. We've only seen 2 episodes, but there's so much more. There are old friends of his who seem to know what happened. They haven't revealed that yet, but they seem to be hiding some things about his missing wife and even the friend he murdered, Susan Berman. So it's kind of funny, too, the way he would call his lawyer and say, "It's Bob." Remember he called his lawyer and he said, "It's Bob. They got me.
They got me.
The FBI." Then he goes on to say something like, "I had a gun and $30,000 and maybe a list of people he wanted to kill." It sounded really bad, and the lawyer's like, "Well, that's not good." But it does seem like he expects the lawyer to get him out of it. Remember, he had killed and dismembered his neighbor in Galveston, and the lawyer actually got him off, even though they conceded and he admitted to doing the dismemberment. So I always thought that was crazy. How do you get a jury to find someone not guilty who's cut up the body? It's crazy.
He had a good lawyer.
Yeah, that money has bought him a lot. So anyway, highly recommended. Hope we can talk about it a little more in a follow-up episode. We're also watching that Chad Daybell trial, so if anyone has comments on that, I'd love to hear it, maybe for some future feedback. Lots of people covering that one, of course, but I just always love to hear the opinions of our listeners, and of course I like to share my opinion from time to time.
Yes, you do.
Okay. Well, I think that's all we've got for today, Dickie.
I'm dry.
So thank you, everyone, for listening. We really appreciate you being here at the Quiet End with us. We'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.